Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to begin our program. And I'm Alyssa Goodman. I'm one of the co-directors for science at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And I would like very much to welcome you all to this virtual event called Next in Water. It's one of a series of events at Radcliffe where we showcase the work of young, fantastic scientists. And we've chosen four great scientists who happen to all be women for you today. And I'll tell you about them in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is share my screen for just a minute here and see where you're all coming from. So let me go ahead and do that. And you should see now a poll link on the screen. And you can go ahead and just type pollev.com/prediction. And then we're going to ask you where you're all coming from today. So I'll just wait just a second here. And I'll let you get that link. And then we'll go ahead and do the poll so I can properly welcome you from all over the world. You should be able to see the links updating live on your screen. The link has also been put in the chat of the webcast today, the webinar. I also see that some people are still just joining us now. So for anyone just joining us now, look in the chat and there's a link where we're surveying everybody where you're coming from. And we notice we have a wide range of time zones today. We also have a wide range of time zones amongst our speakers who are very grateful to joining us all the way from Paris to California. So here we are in the middle. Chris Bowler, my co-host here, I hope he put a little mark in Paris. I'm guessing that's him. Is someone really floating above Alaska? This is fascinating. Great, so Radcliffe loves to have a worldwide audience. One little side effect of this pandemic is that we get to do that. And so the first thing I want to do is notice that the white areas on this map are tremendously larger than the blue areas on this map, unfortunately oddly colored. The white, of course, is water, which is critically important to all of us. And the reason that we chose Next in Water as the theme for this event is because of water's value. And I don't mean the price per liter of water. I mean the value of water to life on Earth, to the survival of our planet, to life on other planets, and to many creatures that we don't even think about that you'll hear about today. And so before I go on, let me say that's probably enough of a survey. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, thank you again for coming. And these are the people who we'd like to feature today, the young scholars. And the order in which you'll hear from them goes from the lower right around in a circle to the lower left. And so I'll start here to tell you Professor Hilary Polevsky comes to us from Boston College, and she will be talking with us about how the ocean absorbs CO2, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere. And then Randy Rojan will tell us how ecological processes govern marine ecosystem restructuring. And by marine ecosystems, we mean things like coral reefs. And then, given that you might hear some bad news about things happening to the atmosphere and coral reefs, after a break, we'll have Cindy Hu tell us about environmental interventions that can most effectively improve public health. And last but certainly not least, you'll hear from Laura Schaefer to tell us what it's like on other planets, even though hopefully we will not have to escape to those other planets. And so our format is described in the schedule that you can find online. And the most important thing for me to point out, there's two. One is that I have a co-host who's a friend and expert about the oceans and about water. His name is Chris Bowler. You'll see him in just a moment. And he comes from an institute in Paris where he works on genomics of very tiny things that he'll tell you something about in a moment. And I should just tell you that I met Chris when we were both Radcliffe Fellows in 2016 to 2017. And he completely opened my eyes to what's in the ocean that we don't think about every day. And he even told us about Tara Oceans, the ship in the background here in this picture that hopefully some of you got to see when it visited Boston a few years ago in conjunction with our Undiscovered Science Conference. So the other important thing I have to tell you is that we're using an odd format today. We have two presenters and discussions before lunch. Then you can go have lunch for half an hour. That's not so odd. And then please do come back and join us. And you can even tell friends who haven't joined us for the first part that they may join for the second part. And then our unconventional twist is that we're having a bit of a reception where we have breakout rooms that you can talk with the speakers. And when we come back after lunch, I'll tell you more about how those breakout rooms will work. But for now, I'd like to pass the virtual floor over to my friend and colleague, Chris Bowler, who tell you a little bit more about the subject matter you're going to hear about today. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Alisa. I hope everybody can hear me. So my name is Chris Bowler. I'm a biologist. I specialize a lot in genomics. I work on marine phytoplankton in particular. And I met Alisa while I was at Radcliffe a few years ago, and a wonderful year of sabbatical from Paris. So I send you my greetings from Paris. The sun is going down here, unfortunately, but we are ahead of you guys. But it's anyhow great to be back in Boston time. It's great to be back at Radcliffe again, even if only virtually this time. But hopefully together we can create the spirit that we all, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with in Knaffel Hall at our great symposia in the past. So we're going to talk today about water. It's all about really raising our appreciation of water, humble, invisible water. It's humble, invisible, but without water, life as we know it cannot exist. We all appreciate that. And the speakers that we're going to hear from today are going to talk about water's vital role across 4 areas of modern inquiry, through biology, through earth science, public health, as well as the search for extraterrestrial life through looking for signs of water in the universe. So it'll be great to see what we can learn from each other from these different disciplines, what we can learn about from each other, and think about together collectively. Hopefully, we'll have plenty of time during the questions and discussions about what are the key issues around water today, but also in the future. What issues are we going to be faced with in the future? Are we going to head towards water wars, conflicts over water in the future? How are we going to manage to keep a good relationship with water on Earth? How are we going to preserve its abundance and its quality, while at the same time keeping it out of our city streets as sea levels rise, of course. So I thought it would be good context to just show you a couple of slides to put us all on the same page to get started, and then we can all set off on this adventure together for the next few hours. So hopefully you'll be able to see that. Okay, so here you have a few planets in our solar system, which I'm sure you will recognize. Planet Earth, you will all recognize it, is blue, even though we call it Earth. It looks like it's mostly water, right? 70% of the surface is water. That's what gives it its blue color. But if we take water out of the equation for a second, and we look at the Earth, you see it actually doesn't look that much different from all of the other planets in our solar system, and planets in general. So it looks very dry. I've also taken the atmosphere out here. The air that we breathe in the atmosphere is represented here in that little ball of air on the surface above Europe. I think that's above Europe. So that represents the tiny skin of air that sits around our planet and ensures habitability essentially for us and all of the other organisms that we share our planet with. So that's a pretty small amount of atmosphere that already gives us an idea that the planet is actually fairly fragile. But that's not the topic of our discussion today. It may be a topic for future what's next symposia at Radcliffe. But we're going to talk about water today. So if we put that water back into the equation of planet Earth, this is what it looks like. So that biggish drop that you see there, that is all the water from the oceans. Okay. So you might think the oceans are big and deep and full of water that's never going to run out, but in fact, there's not that much water as you might think on planet Earth after all. Okay, so the larger drop that you see here is the water in the ocean, and then if you look more closely, you may see two other little drops of water inside. The larger one of those is freshwater water that is present in the poles, in ice, in glaciers, and in freshwater. And the little guy there is the drinking water. Okay, so this is what Cindy is going to talk about this afternoon, following lunch, of course. And Laura this afternoon is going to talk about the search for water in other planets, on other planets within the solar system and beyond. But for the rest of this morning session, we're going to focus on the larger drop, which is the water in the ocean. Follow it with the next two presentations. So I will stop sharing and will happily pass the virtual floor over to Hilary Palevsky, who is going to talk about the ocean and its critical role in regulating carbon dioxide exchange with the atmosphere. So over to you, Hilary.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Alyssa, for those introductions. I am so glad to be virtually here with you all today and want to start by thanking Alyssa and Chris and all the organizers for the hard work that has gone into enabling this event to go forward in this Zoom format, as well as all of you who are joining from all over. It was really great to see in Alyssa's poll that people have taken advantage of this Zoom format to be joining us from all over the US and all over the world. I also wanted to start by acknowledging that coming to you here from Boston, I live and work on the ancestral and unceded land of the Massachusetts people. And for me, as a white climate scientist and oceanographer, it's really important for me to acknowledge the role of settler colonialism in contributing to the global climate change that we're experiencing today and that I'm going to be talking about. It's also really important to center the disproportionate impacts of climate change on Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities, and the leadership of those communities in addressing the problems that I'm going to be talking about today as we discuss the ocean's role in global climate change. And so taking a step back, I want to build on this introduction that Chris gave and give us an overview of how I think about the climate system on Earth broadly. And key bringing in that air component is that carbon dioxide is an atmospheric gas that acts like a heat trapping blanket around our planet. And so for the past 800,000 years, the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have gone both up and down over time. And records of past climate have shown that global temperatures have risen and fallen in concert with these changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide. However, when we burn fossil fuels for energy, we add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so what this is doing is it's thickening this heat trapping blanket around the planet to something we can think about as being more like a really thick down comforter. And so this is disrupting the Earth's climate as these carbon dioxide levels have been increasing. And so now today, these carbon dioxide levels have reached over 400 parts per million, where this number I pulled just this morning is the most recent number published just from 2 days ago. So this has led to a rise in global mean temperatures and resulting effects of climate change, such as increased incidence of heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, and coastal flooding that I'm sure all of you have seen in the local news. And so in my work as a climate scientist, I'm really seeking to both understand and predict the future trajectory of climate change so that we can mitigate and adapt to these changes and reduce the harms that climate change is causing already to people and to society. And so often when we talk about climate change, the conversation really focuses on the atmosphere and on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But the oceans play a really important role in absorbing that atmospheric carbon dioxide and playing a critical role in moderating the Earth's climate. And so this really lovely animation of sea surface currents on this globe illustrates the way I think about the ocean's role in the global climate system as the heart of our Earth's climate, circulating not only heat, but also moisture, nutrients, and carbon throughout the globe. And so to put an even finer point on it, when we talk about this idea of global warming, what we're really talking about is actually ocean warming. This figure shows the warming of the surface ocean over the 4 decades from 1971 to 2010. And we can see that nearly the entire ocean is in these red colors, showing that the average temperatures of the surface ocean have been rising over time. This effect of warming is actually even more pronounced when we calculate the amount of heat that has actually been absorbed by the global oceans, calculated based not just only on temperature changes in the surface ocean, but throughout the entire water column, even kilometers below the surface. So just like you might have observed if you've been boiling water to make tea or pasta, it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water, much more than it takes to warm the atmosphere. And so as a result, we find that the ocean currently absorbs 90% of the heat that's accumulating in the Earth system due to anthropogenic climate change. We can then return to this idea of the ocean as the heart of the Earth's climate system and consider also the role that the ocean plays in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so to do this, I'm now showing you a figure from the Global Carbon Project illustrating modern human carbon emissions from 1900 all the way up until today. And so we can see these gray and brown wedges showing fossil fuel carbon emissions and land use changes that have been adding carbon to the atmosphere each year. And the rate of these emissions, or the rate of these human carbon emissions, has also been accelerating over time. But that's not the whole story. We also want to think about where these carbon emissions are ending up. And so we often focus primarily on this light blue wedge at the bottom, which is the carbon that remains and accumulates in the atmosphere, which, as I described earlier, has been leading to this rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over the 20th and now into the 21st century. However, this increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide would be much more rapid were it not for the large amount of carbon that's being absorbed both by the land and by the ocean. And so in my work as an oceanographer, I focus in particular on the ocean carbon sink, which is absorbing about 1/4 of our current anthropogenic carbon emissions. And so in trying to better understand this ocean carbon sink, an important consideration is that the ocean absorption of carbon from the atmosphere isn't evenly distributed across the globe. There are regions that are shown in blue on this map that are strong sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but there are also these regions in orange that are actually sources emitting that carbon back to the atmosphere. And so this figure is representing both the background flux patterns or exchange rates that we would have found in the pre-industrial era without adding in anthropogenic carbon emissions, and then with these human or anthropogenic carbon emissions added in over top. And so it's really important that we monitor this ocean carbon sink to understand its role in regulating the global climate system today, as well as improve our predictions of how this ocean carbon sink might change in the future. So I've now introduced to you 2 key ways in which the ocean has really what I would think of as a good news role in global climate change by absorbing both the heat and the carbon that would otherwise accumulate in the atmosphere, so slowing the rate of rising atmospheric temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations. However, unfortunately, there's a bad news side of this as well, which is that the heat and the carbon that the ocean is absorbing are also driving ocean changes. So rising ocean temperatures can have a detrimental effect on marine ecosystems that are not adapted to these warmer temperatures. And rising ocean temperatures also creates conditions that enable stronger and more damaging hurricanes to develop, like we've been seeing in the news throughout this entire late summer and fall hurricane season. The warming ocean is also driving rising sea levels because warmer water actually expands. And so this is already causing flooding and erosion in frontline coastal communities, such as this location in Kivalina, Alaska, that I've shown here on the slide. Now, in addition to the warming and sea level rise, we can also think about the ocean change size of the ocean taking up that carbon from the atmosphere. And as the ocean absorbs that extra carbon dioxide, it forms carbonic acid when it dissolves in water, which is increasing the acidity of the oceans. So this is already affecting sensitive marine organisms, such as this image of a dissolving pteropod that's shown here, and also poses threats to commercially and culturally important species, such as oysters and other shellfish. So in order to really monitor these ongoing changes, both to understand the climate services that the ocean is providing, as well as better understand and predict these changes that are unfolding, my research seeks to better understand what's going on in this ocean carbon sink. And so in order to do this, we really have to get under the hood and understand the individual biological, chemical, and physical mechanisms that enable the ocean to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And so a lot of my work focuses on the mechanism on the left, which is known as the biological pump. And this all starts with phytoplankton in the surface ocean, which I was glad to hear Chris mention in his introduction. So phytoplankton, we can think of as being like the plants of the ocean that are going to do photosynthesis and transform carbon dioxide into organic carbon. Just like the plants in the ocean, they use light and nutrients to do this process of photosynthesis using a pigment called chlorophyll that makes them green. And so some fraction of the carbon dioxide that's turned into organic carbon is then going to be recycled in the surface ocean as those phytoplankton are food for zooplankton and for higher trophic levels, as well as be consumed and respired by bacteria. But some fraction of that organic carbon produced by the phytoplankton is going to escape being consumed and respired and sink out into the deep ocean, where it can be sequestered or stored away from contact with the atmosphere on timescales from months to centuries. Now, in addition to this biological process, chemistry and physics also play a really important role, where colder waters are more soluble or can absorb more carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere. So those waters in the surface ocean that are cold with higher solubility for carbon dioxide can then be subducted into the deep ocean by physical circulation and again stored away from contact with the atmosphere on timescales from months to centuries. So my research group uses a range of methods and data sources to really address two key questions about this ocean carbon sink. First, we want to measure this how much question. We want to know how much carbon the ocean is absorbing by each of these chemical, physical, and biological processes. But knowing how much isn't enough if we can't also answer the really important question of why. And we need to know why to enable us to mechanistically predict how the ocean carbon sink will respond to ongoing global climate change and ultimately serve as an important feedback mechanism on those future changes. So I've shown on this slide here a whole range of different approaches, both biogeochemical measurements and analysis of global data sets that I use in my research. And today I'm going to focus on one story about biogeochemical measurements from autonomous platforms, like these shown on the top right, and how using these measurements is increasing our capacity to measure carbon cycling in hard to sample ocean regions and can improve our understanding of this ocean carbon sink. And so my work recently has been using a lot of data that comes from this Ocean Observatories initiative funded by the National Science Foundation. And so the Ocean Observatories initiative is a series of arrays of both moored and mobile platforms with co-located autonomous sensors measuring biogeochemical and physical properties. And so these are really exciting in that we've put this set of autonomous sampling platforms, both buoys like the one shown in the middle, and these mobile underwater vehicles like the one shown on the top right, in a lot of these places in the high latitude North Atlantic, North Pacific, and Southern Ocean to help us get insights into what's happening in these places that are hard to go out to in ships throughout the full year. And so I'm going to tell you in particular today about some of my work that's been focusing on the subpolar North Atlantic Ocean. And I'm particularly interested in the subpolar North Atlantic Ocean because of this large spring of phytoplankton bloom that's illustrated here in this really lovely animation of satellite ocean chlorophyll. So we can see this seasonal greening up of the North Atlantic every spring. And so we know from past work that this spring bloom drives significant biological carbon export during that productive season. But the question that I'm really interested in answering is how much of that carbon is ultimately being stored away from the atmosphere on climate relevant timescales. And so in order to do this, I've been looking at these autonomous measurements coming from the location that I've shown here in the pink star in the subpolar North Atlantic between Iceland and Greenland. And so in order to think about what's happening in this high latitude region, we have to think about the interactions between biological and physical processes. And in addition to the biology being really exciting in this region, the physics in the subpolar North Atlantic also has a really strong seasonal cycle. And in order to understand this, we have to think about the fact that the ocean is divided into a series of layers based on density. This is actually an image of the kind of experiment that I do to illustrate that with my undergraduate intro oceanography students, where you can dye different waters with different food coloring. And we can see that warmer, less dense water floats on top of the colder, denser water below. And so in the context of what we see in the ocean, that warmer layer on top is going to isolate the layers below from contact with the atmosphere and prevent them from exchanging their carbon with the atmosphere. So there's one layer at the surface of the ocean, this mixed layer, that's going to actually be the layer that exchanges carbon with the atmosphere, and layers below are able to trap carbon within them. And so we can see that the depth of this mixed layer varies throughout the year, where in spring and summer, the mixed layer is shallow, the ocean is well stratified when wind speeds are slow and atmospheric temperatures are cool. But then when the wind speeds pick up in winter and the atmosphere cools, that mixed layer can deepen down to greater than 1,000 meters in winter. And so if we think about how the biology is interacting with this seasonal cycle in the physics, we know that we have these phytoplankton in the surface ocean photosynthesizing, converting carbon dioxide into organic carbon during this part of the year that the ocean is well stratified. And some of those phytoplankton particles, the organic carbon, sinks out into the deep ocean. But that's not the end of the story, because as those particles are sinking through the water column, they're actively being consumed and respired by heterotrophic organisms. And so then when this mixed layer deepens in winter, we entrain that respired carbon back into the mixed layer and ventilate it back to the atmosphere. So unless that sinking organic carbon penetrates below the wintered ventilation depth, or the deepest layer that's in contact with the atmosphere each year, it's not actually going to be stored long term. And so in order to understand this process, what I'm really interested in doing in my work is understanding the total amount of biologically sequestered carbon each year, as well as getting into that why question and looking at the balance between how much carbon is seasonally exported each summer, and then how much of it is ventilated each subsequent winter. And so the tool that I use to do this are measurements of dissolved oxygen. And this Ocean Observatories Initiative program is really exciting because it's providing us our first opportunity to have oxygen measurements throughout the full water column and throughout the full seasonal cycle in this region, using oxygen as a tracer to tell us about the balance between net photosynthesis and net respiration. So recent work that I've been doing, funded by the National Science Foundation, has been going out to this location in the North Atlantic where we did field work at this array in the summers of 2018 and 2019 to deploy autonomous underwater vehicles that allow us to collect more accurate oxygen data, like this vehicle shown here on the left, that's ultimately allowing us to close that carbon budget and better understand this ocean carbon sequestration long term. So before I conclude, I want to come back to the summary of the good and bad news about the ocean's role in global climate change. So while my research is helping us to better understand how these ocean climate services and ocean changes are happening today and predict how they will unfold in the future, it's also really important that we pay attention to the fact that climate change is already a serious crisis and it's already causing harm to people today. So it's easy and tempting to feel a sense of despair in the face of these ongoing changes. And as a result, the question I am asked most frequently when I talk about climate change is what gives me hope in the face of this crisis? But to draw on a lesson really beautifully articulated by climate scientist Dr. Kate Marvel, hope is really the wrong question. She writes, the opposite of hope is not despair, it is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage we can mourn, we need courage, not hope. And so I will say that what gives me courage is the example of the current generation of new climate leaders who are providing inspiration, ideas, and solutions for how to address the climate crisis, including many of the voices in this really fabulous new book, All We Can Save, edited by Drs. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson, which is actually currently on my bedside table. I also included this map of the United States showing that across nearly the entire country, only about 35% of adults even occasionally discuss climate change. And this is a problem because key to gathering the courage and motivation to take action is this first step of even having conversations about the problem. So I wanted to leave you with a reminder that the choices we as a society make today will dramatically influence how climate change unfolds over the 21st century. This figure shows the 4 scenarios used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their last assessment report to project how climate change might unfold going forward, depending on choices about the rates of human fossil fuel emissions. And these scenarios lead to dramatically different outcomes for climate and ocean change, shown here for sea level rise and ocean acidification. So even though some of these consequences are going to happen no matter what choices we make today, we can still influence which of these climate and ocean change pathways humanity will choose to take. And so with that, thank you. And I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you, Hilary. Fantastic presentation to get us going. I fully agree with you that we have a wonderful new generation of young scientists and young sensitized people who are ready to, I think, deal with a lot of these issues that you brought up. So I think it is important to not be too depressed about where we're headed, because I think there are things that we can think about doing collectively together. We had a lot of questions coming in. I think we can move some of them to later, but we can certainly try and address a couple of them now. And perhaps in the spirit of what I was just mentioning, there's a question about what, in your opinion, would be the actionable steps that we could take to ameliorate rising ocean temperatures and biodiversity losses as individuals, let's say.
Yeah, so I know, first of all, I'll point ahead to particularly for biodiversity. Some of that will come up in Randy's talk coming up next. But I think one of the things that I often see framed as a dichotomy in talking about approaching the climate crisis is whether we should focus on individual action or on collective action. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that some of these changes require coordinated collective action. So the kinds of things you contribute to by voting, by choosing our elected leaders, and by supporting the kinds of policies that are going to lead to coordinated statewide, national, and international action. That doesn't mean that it's not also important to make choices in your own life. And I think everyone has different capacity to think about which kinds of choices you can make. Some of those choices are about mitigation, so reducing the amount of carbon emissions, so focusing on our carbon footprint. And some of those choices are about adaptation. And the thing that I would highlight as being really important here is when we think about mitigation and adaptation, we want to really think about the needs of these frontline communities. And so think about how we highlight a just transition from the fossil fuels we're using today to carbon neutral economy in the future, and think about how we can accomplish that in a way that centers the needs of the people who are already being most affected and have contributed least to the problem, who are tend to be our Indigenous, Black, and Brown frontline communities.
Great. Do we have time for one more question? Perhaps we can, a more directed question. You showed very nicely how biology together with physics and chemistry, everything participates in bringing carbon dioxide into the ocean. And we see the intricacy of the Earth system, in that biology is an intricate part of the physics and chemistry, which is not always appreciated, which we often forget. So it was very nice that you showed that very nicely in a talk. Could you just give us an idea of how important is the biology for the carbon pump into the ocean compared with the physics and chemistry, and how important is the ocean compared to land, photosynthesis in plants and stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I showed that slide showing the ocean carbon sink compared with the land carbon sink, it was thinking about the anthropogenic influence. So how much extra carbon we think the ocean is taking up because of the influence of human carbon emissions. And so our current understanding to date is most of that extra carbon that the ocean is taking up is being driven by these chemical and physical processes and less by changes in the biology. But a really important caveat here is that the baseline background of the total rate at which that biological pump moves carbon from the surface to the deep ocean is about the same magnitude as our total annual fossil fuel carbon emissions. So it's a big flux. And so if we perturb that system and we slow down the rate of the biological pump, it would lead to a really big feedback effect on global climate. And conversely, if these changes to ocean ecosystems actually led to an increase in the ability of the biological pump to sequester that carbon, it also could play a really important role in slowing down the rate of that carbon accumulation in the atmosphere. So we don't yet have good enough numbers to really well quantify that, but that's the reason that I focus on that in my research, because it could play a really important role going forward.
Great. Thanks,
Thank
Hilary.
you. Thank you, Hilary and
We'll address
Chris.
other questions later. Yeah, I'll hand over to Alisa to introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, no, that was just a wonderful conversation. And I'm so glad that Chris asked that question at the end, because this interplay between physics, chemistry, and biology is really one of the themes that we want to address today. So we'll definitely talk about that more in the discussion with all of the speakers again at the end. So thank you, Hilary. One other thing that I really wanted to talk about at the end, so I'll just sort of put a pin in it for now, just to come back to later, is you just said, Hilary, something really important, which is that there aren't good enough numbers to actually make calculations and to make estimates. And I really want to talk about prediction and how good we are or how not good we are at predicting things that happen in the water, in the atmosphere, on other planets, et cetera, all together at the end. So we'll just remind ourselves to come back to that later. But for now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Randy Rojan, who's going to tell us about coral reefs and more, and the effects of what you just heard from Hillary on life under the ocean. So go right ahead, Randy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, all of the organizers. This is an incredible opportunity to be able to speak to you all about really, so many, well, I say one very important topic, but really so many different important topics rolled into this. And I think I need to do this again. Hide floating. All right, hopefully you don't see any dark boxes anymore. I also want to say a big thank you to Hillary for the really enlightening talk. And I think about carbon and climate change too, but what I hadn't thought about was that hope is not what we need, and it's courage that we need. And I really think that resonated, and I'm going to hopefully be a little courageous today in showing you. I prepared this talk thinking that I would talk to you about ecology. And then as I spoke to the organizers about this and began to realize how many different facets of the ocean were interesting to people, I thought I would share a more personal story interwoven with some ecology, and that takes a little bit of bravery to share, because I'm going to take you to places I never thought I'd go. So today we're going to discuss facts, fury, and the future of the oceans in 3 short examples. And I wanted to thank Chris for starting here with these iconic shots from space. I think we all forget how special these pictures are, right? How hard won they are, and how fragile our planet is. And then when we look at these images of this blue marble floating in space, our vulnerability really comes into sharp focus. So that vulnerability is multifaceted. There are multiple different ways in which our world and our oceans, which are of course 71% of our planet, are suffering right now. Overfishing is a big part of the conversation, as Hillary just mentioned, climate change, including warming, but of course acidification, and of course sea level rise, as Hillary mentioned, right, are all part of that equation. And then there's an increasing amount of marine debris, which is entering our oceans at an alarming rate. I didn't go into ocean science to study any of these things. I became an ecologist because I wanted to study life, thriving, natural interactions, competition, predation, try to understand how the natural world works. But my work has been interrupted. And the work of almost everybody I know has been interrupted by these and other major global changes in the ocean, because we can't ignore them. They show up in our samples, they show up in our time signatures, and we can't study ecology outside of the equation of ourselves. So for me, all paths lead to the ocean from a research perspective. But today, I'm going to talk to you about the fact that literally all paths lead to the ocean. And they do this through a multitude of ways. But one of the biggest, we have many, many issues in our anthropogenic oceans. But one of them, which is something that we just can't ignore anymore, is marine debris. And marine debris doesn't, of course, start in the oceans, right? It starts, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this big green bar starts on land with the global production of 270 million tons of plastic per year, of which about 8 million tons annually end up in the ocean. And actually very little of that ends up on the surface waters. The vast majority of it ends up immersed in the ocean. And this is an 8 million ton annual contribution to what ends up in the ocean, which has no way out. So some plastic facts just to make you furious. This is actually taken from Waste Reduction Week in Canada, but so just a couple things which apply to us all, no matter where we are in the world. I love this map that Alyssa showed of everybody from all over the world coming today. But roughly 1 million plastic bottles are brought around the world, bought around the world every minute. 8 million metric tons of plastic enters the Earth's ocean annually, like I showed you. 40% of that is generated through packaging, which is something individual packaging has become. There are many environmental potential benefits from COVID, but that might be something where we see a detriment. And of course, very little of this has been recycled. And while there's 8 million metric tons entering the oceans annually, the order of magnitude jump to 8 billion metric tons generated across the world since the 1950s is a terrifying number. So essentially, we're swimming in a mess of our own making. And today I'm going to tell you 3 about 3 interruptions to my business as usual research life, in this case, in the form of surprise plastics, hidden problems and secret corals, and lurking in the abyss. So first, surprise plastics. And for this, I have to give some credit to my 2 fantastic students, Haley Goss and Jacob Jaskill, who, this is just a fantastic picture of them here in Boston, but we went to Belize, a place where I've been working for about 20 years to study something completely different. We were working on an offshore atoll of Belize, and I'm really interested in parrotfish predation on corals, and parrotfish actually eat a whole bunch of other things. In fact, most of the time they don't eat corals at all. They eat seagrass and algae. And so we were looking at the dynamics of how parrotfish consume seagrasses. And we were doing this really careful experiment. You can see up in top in panel B here, you can see these beautiful pieces of seagrass and those cute little cutouts or parrotfish bites. And we were quantifying the epibionts, right? The organisms that live on top of the seagrass to see if parrotfish discriminated against eating those extra organisms, those epibionts, or in fact preferred them. And Haley and Jacob were doing this very careful job of characterizing the epibiont structure under the microscope. Here we are, interested in ecology, interested in ecosystems, interested in predation and consumption events. And all of a sudden, Haley says, what's this? And she points out a bunch of plastic under the microscope on the seagrass blade. And my first thought was to dismiss it entirely. I said, no, 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 no. We are shedding plastics all the time, microplastics, right? 5 millimeters or smaller pieces of plastic. I am sure that this is contamination from us. And as we looked closer, it became clear that despite us desperately trying to hope that there wasn't plastic on seagrass, we were wrong. You can see that these microplastic particles are embedded within the epibiont structure. They are literally glued to the surface of the seagrass by other organisms themselves, which means that this is not derived from the clothing that I'm wearing as I'm looking over the microscope, but this is derived from macroplastics in the ocean, which could come from clothing or could come from ropes or bottles or any other or plastic bags, which are breaking down, floating through the ocean and ending up on seagrass blades. It turns out that the more epibionts you have on a seagrass blade, the more microplastics attached to this. And it also turns out that the more epibionts and the more microplastics on a blade of grass, the more a fish is likely to eat them. Now, it's no surprise that plastics are bioaccumulating through food chains. But what's surprising is that they're bioaccumulating through herbivorous food chains. So for a long time, or for a while, we thought herbivores might be the exception to the rule. They're not eating organisms, which are then eating other organisms, which are then eating other organisms, which are eating plankton, which are eating microplastics. So perhaps they are immune from this bioaccumulative pathway of microplastic accumulation. And in fact, if you look at microplastic accumulation food webs or food chains, indeed, herbivorous pathways were for the most part left out. The problem with microplastics accumulating on seagrasses and algae is that this means that herbivores are not left out of the pathway. And now there's virtually no pathway, no stone left unturned or no pathway left uneaten for whereby microplastics can't accumulate in the oceans and up the food chain. In essence, this cartoon says it all. Can I have a plastic bag, please? It's in the fish, sir. I'm sorry to say. So back to my normal life for a moment. I really don't study microplastics very often. I study corals, and I study corallivory and things that eat corals. And I work on a lot of different coral-related issues. And one of the corals that I work on is a really cool hidden coral reef here in New England. Yes, that's right. I said a hidden coral reef here in New England. Below the surface of these waters actually lies a single species of calcareous scleractinian coral. This is it. It's a Strangia poculata. This is at the northern end of its range, which you can see here articulated in red. We've been studying this for years. It's a really interesting model coral to look at trophic dynamics, to look at the influence of various aspects of global change on scleractinian calcifying corals. That's not tropical, right? So we have this mouse model for tropical corals that we can use right here in my own backyard. And as we were starting to work on this coral, same story. we got interrupted by finding plastics in the midst of our experiments. So we looked to see if there were truly microplastic accumulations in wild corals at alarming rates. And we looked to see what those plastics looked like. So what you're looking at here, this glob of brown tissue, is actually a coral that has been fixed, decalcified, and dissected. And what you're looking at are the bright microplastic fibers in this top section and this small microplastic bead on the bottom. And it turns out that corals will eat beads, fibers, there's some miscellaneous chips and things like that, right, with other shapes that will break down. But the average number of microplastics that we found in these coastal corals per polyp, right, these colonial animals, if you take a look over here, each one of those little circles is a polyp, was 112 pieces of plastic per polyp. So we put our other experiments aside for a moment, and because there hadn't been work done yet on microplastic accumulation in corals, and looked to see if we could replicate this in the lab. We could feed these corals. You can see the blue fluorescent bead inside the gastrovascular cavity, and hopefully this movie will work. If we feed corals microplastic beads, they readily vacuum them up. Delicious, except not. So we did some experiments. We realized that microplastic beads in brine shrimp eggs could be roughly the same size, same texture, and we could do some experiments looking for coral preference, hoping, of course, that they would prefer brine shrimp eggs, which are, though it's not something they regularly encounter in the wild, of course, have nutritional value and are similar to things they might encounter in the wild. And this kind of experiment is what we did, and it's kind of terrifying because in every single case, whenever we gave an equal number of brine shrimp eggs and microplastic beads to corals, 100% of the time, they consumed more plastics than brine shrimp eggs. Fast forward a step further, we realized that these microplastics they can be eaten. Sometimes if they're beads, they can be spit back out. We were actually watching ingestion, egestion dynamics. So we were wondering if they get eaten and taken in and spit back out, are they actually vectoring microbes from polyp to polyp or coral to coral or population to population? So we coated these microplastic beads with GFP tagged E. coli, fed them to corals, and found that for control polyps up here on the top, we could feed a polyp, we could feed beads that did not have this tagged E. coli, and they were fine. But if you fed them GFP tagged E. coli, and you looked at the focal polyp, within 28 days, there was mortality, and there was mortality in the neighboring polyps as well. So it looks like these beads can be vectors for potential putative disease. And so microplastics are not just a problem from the plastics itself, the ingestion potential, but also the hitchhikers that they carry with them. And if you take a look at this, you can see the blue bead, the green is the E. coli coated the bead, and when you see them merged, you can see them inside the coral polyp. All right, so like I told you, I'm not generally a plastics researcher, so back to my normal world, I often, again, think about corals, and I'm going to take you to my last story, which actually does not take place in this part of the world. So I'm not thinking about the Atlantic. I'm going to shift your focus to the Pacific for two reasons. One, of course, is to let you also see how big the Pacific is, right? And the United States government, as part of a 3-year exploration tour, up in this top corner, you'll be able to see the ship tracks over a 3-year tour of the US explorer ship, Okeanos Explorer, which was going to do deep sea exploration. I mean, deep sea, lower than 200 meters, down to 6,000 meters, all over Pacific remote islands, marine national monuments, marine protected areas, and this pink protected area is the Phoenix Islands in Kiribati, and this purple spot is Papahanaumokuakea. And while this US government ship was out exploring the oceans and looking at beautiful and long-lived deep sea corals that live for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, deep sea sponges, which are just incredibly beautiful, colorful, look Zeus-like, and have all kinds of interesting ecological roles that we're just beginning to understand. Of course, when you think about the deep sea, we sometimes think about the unique creatures. Sometimes people think about shipwrecks. Sometimes people think about Amelia Earhart's plane crashing. And unfortunately, those anthropogenic pieces are part of the story, right? Even on these deep sea cruises where you're going up these underwater mountain chains with just a a relatively large ROV, but just these lights, these tiny little trails that you can only see what's lighting up in front of you because it's so dark that no sunlight shines. You see these incredible organisms, and you also see us on the bottom of the ocean. So not in high numbers, I'm happy to report. So in the far-flung remote ocean, we do see marine debris, but less so than we do in our coastal oceans. But my point is that no matter where we are, we can't escape ourselves. And in fact, a study was just published this week that showed that 14 million tons of microplastic was accumulating on the seafloor, even in our global oceans. And that's even in the remote deep sea. The future, the good news. There are credible paths to significantly reducing plastics in the ocean, but they require multiple solutions. They require multiple things to happen at once. A business as usual scenario is going to increase our plastic consumption, use, and deposition in the oceans. But if we can reduce, substitute, recycle, dispose of, and revert mismanagement to proper management, then a lot of exciting things can happen. And this was a paper just published by some colleagues at Pew in Science very recently, just 2 months ago. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity for us all to assess how we can put multiple solutions together so that we can think about how to solve this problem effectively and quickly. And their models showed that we can actually achieve an 80% reduction by 2040 if we put multiple management strategies into place. Just to wrap up, like I told you before, I didn't become an ecologist to study plastic. We have to study it sometimes because it's in our way. And to ignore what we see in front of us is to not do our science and our scientific training justice. But I love this quote. The greatest wonder of the sea is that it is still alive, despite all that we've thrown at it so far. And that gives me hope, or as Hillary pointed out, it should give us courage to do what needs to be done. And so the vast majority of my time I spend thinking about this tiny or big, depending on how you want to look at it, protected area in the Central Pacific, owned by the Republic of Kiribati, who has had the courage to protect one of the most important places of the ocean. This is a country, a least developed country, that has put together a marine protected area the size of California and has made it no take, protecting it against all kinds of ocean problems. However, even these lines can't keep out climate change. This is a spot that was beautiful in the year 2002, following several marine heat waves, had almost 100% coral loss. But what places like the Phoenix Islands can show us is that corals can recover when they're not dealing with everything at the same time. This place, this California-sized box in the Central Pacific, has deep sea, it has ocean seamounts, it has islands, it has a ton of open ocean. There's a lot of stories to tell here, but importantly, it's protected. It's protected against overfishing. So these are the fishing days before it was closed, and now here's how much fishing effort is happening after it's closed, essentially none. It's been very effective. There are very few people. There's no permanent population of people living there and constantly throwing debris into the oceans. And even though it's very sensitive to El Nino dynamics and climate change, it's a chance for us to study nature in the best of our ability in this modern world. It's a place where there are so few people that we can ask the tough questions about how much can our oceans handle when we're not right there adding more stuff into it. And so all paths lead to the oceans, even remote oceans, even in the deepest of seas and in the most remote of areas, we see evidence of ourselves. And this is really obvious when you think about the way we live our lives and the fact that we all live in watersheds. You know, Hillary ended on a map of the United States, and I will too. You know, when you look at the United States from a watershed perspective, you know, I often look at the Mississippi River watershed and I think about, my God, if I was an oyster living here, what would I experience? And even if you're not living in a place, I saw that beautiful map of people all around the globe, you know, listening today, wherever you are in the world, what you do in your backyard, in your daily life, in the municipality that you belong to, and in the votes that you make and the actions that you take contributes to the ocean. And so with that, thank you. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Randy. Fantastic. Indeed, the oceans are pretty sick, but there's still lots of amazing life going on there, and lots of reasons why we can aim to improve things in the future. As you say, there are paths forward that that are doable, right? It's taken us a long time to appreciate just how bad all of this plastic has been for the ocean, and I think now we pretty much appreciate that. And of course, it's ugly to look at. It's very sad to see all of that plastic in these beautiful places that you have shown us. But how much is plastic debris actually changing marine life, would you say? How much is it changing marine ecosystems? You know, it's something new in the ecosystem that has only really started to appear like after the Second World War.
Right.
And do we know how much, whether it's changing, evolving, leading to evolution of life somehow in the ocean?
I love that question, and it's a really important one. And I would say that I think the science is, we're at the beginning of answering that question rather at the end. And so many colleagues of mine throughout the world do study plastic pollution full time. These three stories are ones that, as I said, have sort of interrupted our thing, some of our normal work or things we've come across. But what I would say is that there are studies that show that plastics can interrupt food acquisition and digestion in a number of organisms, including plankton, zooplankton, which is very important because they sit at the base of the food web. And if we have major loss of zooplankton due to either starvation or whether it's, the mechanism of mortality, it could either be starvation or it could be disease vectoring, or it could be, a number of, or chemical leaching, right? There's a number of different things that could contribute to this. But a loss of a major part of our basal part of the food web is really problematic. Some of the other issues may be more subtle, meaning that they may not be immediate mortality, but they may have sublethal effects. And in fact, I would venture a guess that that's where we'll see the majority of the interactions and a lot of the impacts of these plastics. Sublethal effects that we don't fully understand for a while to come. But the reality is that we are eating plastics. We are drinking plastics as well. And we don't know the impact. We don't fully understand, I don't think, the impact on ourselves or on marine life either. And the chemical leaching is one piece of this. There's also the structure of the plastic itself. Imagine 110 pieces of microplastic fiber wedged into the gastrovascular cavity of that coral I showed you. Of course, it's going to affect the structural matrix of the way that organism is living its life. And in addition, of course, the microbial vectoring, I think, has the potential to, if it can be ingested and egested, we're in a global pandemic. I think we're all thinking about infection in different ways than we ever have before. And I think paying attention to how that might happen in the ocean, pandemic aside, is I think one of the areas that's ripe for more investigation.
Yeah, I would just like to ask one question, Randy, because I know that some of our participants are eager to have lunch. But I just want to say that was just absolutely fantastic, and the connections to Hillary's talk are great, and I think everybody will see the connections to this afternoon later. So I'm just going to ask one sort of physics/biology/chemistry question, which is, we heard Hillary talk about the difference between basically the heat capacity of air and of water. And what that translates to is that it takes a very long time to change the temperature of water compared to change the temperature of air. And so I'm curious, with the plastics, and the coral reefs, you showed the coral reefs recovering over some period of time. So are people thinking about what the interplay is between, say, the temperature of the ocean, the acidity of the ocean, and then the amount of plastic? Like, I assume that the timescales involved in changing things, it's all interdependent, the physics, the chemistry, and the biology. So that's maybe a question for our discussion later, but I guess now you can just go, yes, people are thinking about that, or tell me how they're thinking or they're not.
I'll keep it quick. I don't want to keep people from lunch, but I guess I'll say that the thing to avoid is death by 1,000 cuts. Right. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. I don't think we can talk about climate change by itself or plastic pollution by itself without also putting this all in the context of human demographic change. Right. We have a huge global population of people. A lot of the things that we do wouldn't be so bad if we had, I don't know, a third of us or a quarter of us on the planet. Right. Which is where we were, a mere 100 years ago. And so thinking about all of these things simultaneously, I think, is a growing area of interest. I think it's really hard to put everything together. And so some of the most effective work is coming from modelers and meta-analyses that I think are able to put the relative context of each one of these things together across multiple ecosystems and organisms. But we can have a much bigger conversation about this afterwards. And I'm hoping we do, because
Perfect.
it's a bigger conversation.
Perfect. I'm so pleased with the range of speakers that we've chosen. And so I know what people are going to speak about after lunch, and just come back, everybody. So before you go away, what I'll say is that we would like to resume at 12:30. And so for those of you where it's a mealtime or a coffee time, go ahead and enjoy. And the webinar here will stay open. You can just leave it open on your computer. We won't be talking again until 12:30. I believe you can still enter questions in the questions and answers if you have for later. And in the background, by the way, we have a brilliant Harvard College student, Elliot Hyman, who is collating all your questions and trying to combine some of them and save them for later. So we apologize if we don't get to exactly your question, but hopefully we'll try to cover the scope of the audience interest. And as I said before, there'll be this opportunity for audience participation in Zoom rooms at the very close of the program. And so please do come back for that. And over this little lunch break, go ahead and encourage other friends of yours to join us online, or otherwise, like I said, they'll be able to watch this for posterity, archived at the Radcliffe website in the future. So thank you very much for now, and I'll sign off for right now. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hello there. Hi again, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch, dinner, coffee, glass of wine, whatever it is that floated your boat. Ha ha ha, it's a water joke. Uh, so I think we're ready to get started again. And so I know that some of the people who are joining us now for Next in Water at Radcliffe, just to make sure you're at the right webinar, and I'm Alyssa Goodman, your host, co-director for science. Some of you may not have met the other speakers or heard their talks, so I'll tell you who's going to be speaking again in just a moment. But just a quick logistical reminder that after the two talks that are coming up, we'll have a discussion amongst all of the speakers, and that will include Chris Bowler, our expert host, and me. And then after that, you have it will be explained to you. You'll have another link to go to. This is a Zoom webinar. The other link is a Zoom meeting that will let us put you all in breakout rooms. We're really sorry that we can't give you canapes and coffee and tea and champagne and what we would normally give you at Radcliffe, but we can give you the conversation, which we hope is the most valuable part of what you would otherwise experience in person after the symposium, after the event. So anyway, let me just take a minute here to go back to where we were. And so we heard two wonderful talks this morning from Hillary Polevsky, who told us about how water in the ocean absorbs and emits CO2 and the complexities involved in that. And then we heard another talk just before lunch by Randy Rojan, where she actually told us a lot about plastics in the ocean and how that's not her normal work, but that this new phenomenon is so important to her normal work that we should really all pay attention. And so now, after lunch, we're going to move a little bit into the pollution that's quite related to the processes that Hillary and Randy were discussing before lunch. And we're going to hear from Cindy who will give us a talk first for 20 minutes, and then we'll ask her a few questions. And again, if you weren't with us before, please put questions for the speakers in the question and answer on the Zoom webinar. And like I said before, those questions will be consolidated and we'll use some of them during the discussion and some of them during the breakouts later. And then right after Cindy, we'll pass it on to Laura, who's going to tell us about water on extrasolar planets outside of our solar system, and see whether any of what she has to say, which I think it will, connects back to what we heard earlier from our other speakers. And so just to remind you, Cindy is going to talk about environmental interventions that can possibly improve public health through cleaning up water pollution. And Laura will speak specifically about what the atmospheres are like on other planets. And again, just to reintroduce my co-host, Chris Bowler, he and I were Radcliffe Fellows together in 2016. And when I was young, I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. And Chris Bowler, I can just sum it up, is the closest thing I know to Jacques Cousteau, except he knows a lot more about plankton than Jacques Cousteau did. So let me now just introduce Cindy, who's coming to us from Mathematica, and she's currently in California. And let me pass the virtual floor over to her. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Elisa. I will share my screen.
Let me stop sharing my screen. Hang on, sorry.
Thank you, Elisa, for the warm introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for putting together such a wonderful, wonderful program. I'll be talking to you today about the water that is a little bit closer to our daily life, drinking water. We think of drinking water as this colorless, odorless, and tasteless thing. And most of the time, except for very extreme circumstances like what happened, unfortunately, in Flint, Michigan, you can't really see drinking water quality. What I want to convey to you today is how we can use data science and data visualization to visualize drinking water quality, making the invisible visible, and to improve drinking water quality and public health. Let me ask you a question. What is in my water? So participants, if you have your phone next to you, please go to menti.com and answer a question. If I tell you there are 80,000 chemicals used in commerce, can you guess how many are regulated in drinking water? And if you put the code in the Mentipool, you should be able to see a sliding bar, and each dial represents 1,000 chemicals. So if you think 10,000 chemicals are regulated in drinking water, please put 10. If you think 20,000 chemicals are regulated in drinking water, please put 20. I see we are already getting 10 answers. Thank you all participants for your answers. So hopefully you can all see the live results. Some people think 0 or 1, but I think the average is around 15, 16, which means that people think we regulate about 15,000 chemicals in our drinking water. So what is the correct answer? Let me go back to the slide. As you can see, the majority of the chemicals are not regulated, and only 96 out of 80,000 chemicals are regulated. And I will introduce a little bit about the governing law in the US for safe drinking water, called the Safe Drinking Water Act. In 1974, the initial 30 chemicals were regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in 1992, additional 66 were added. We haven't added any new chemicals since then, and that is more than 20 years ago. In 1996, the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended to have an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule program. And this program requires the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to collect data for chemicals that are suspected to be present in drinking water, but we just don't have a health-based standards yet. Every 5 years, 30 contaminants will be monitored. Now we know the vast majority of chemicals in drinking water are not regulated. So what are they? Unregulated chemicals can be classified into these following broad categories. And today we'll be focusing on one class called the highly fluorinated compounds. They also have a more formal name called poly and perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. This family has over 4,000 anthropogenic chemicals, and here are a list of commonly seen 6. And if you're interested in hearing more and knowing more about these chemicals, I encourage you to go to whatisinmywater.org, which is an interactive data visualization platform that I put together with 2 other collaborators a few years ago. So for the rest of the talk, I will be focusing on PFAS. What are PFAS and why are they important? They are anthropogenic chemicals widely found in Americans. Up to 98% American people have detectable level of PFAS in their blood. And they're very useful. You can find them in a lot of applications such as rain jackets, pizza boxes, firefighting foams, nonstick cookware, etc. And we're all working from home these days. So I bet if you take a round at your environment around you, you're going to find a lot of these objects. They're very persistent, which means that they don't break down and can be transported over very long distances. Scientists have found them in the most remote regions on Earth, such as in polar bears near the North Pole. And PFAS have already caused a lot of concerns in local community. Here's a photograph showing residents from Hoosick Falls, New York in 2016. They were gathered to call for legislative hearings after finding out their drinking water has been contaminated. And research has shown that there are probable links between PFAS exposure and testicular and kidney cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. So we know PFAS contamination is widespread. So how did it make its way into our drinking water? This film shows the chronology of discovering contamination sites across the United States. Each bubble represents a site. The color of it shows the type of sources. If it is purple, it means that it's fluorochemical manufacturing site. If it is blue, it means that it's an Air Force base or airport. And the size of the bubble shows the size of the local community impacted. As you can see here, initially contamination sites were discovered near industry sites, and as time goes on, more contamination sites were found near military bases and airports. And more recently, we start to discover more diverse types of sources. And now we know there are PFAS contamination sites across the US. The question is, can we see its impact in our drinking water? You may recall from a couple of slides ago when I introduced the governing law of drinking water quality in the US, I mentioned something called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR. In 2013 to 2015, the third UCMR included 6 PFAS in their monitoring program. And more than 36,000 finished drinking water samples were collected from close to 5,000 drinking water treatment plants. And these are finished drinking water that will be distributed to individual homes. The data is publicly available, but the format of it is just like what is shown on the screen here. It's plain text after plain text. So if I ask you to go in here and find whether PFAS contamination has impacted your region, it's not that easy to do. So how do we put this kind of data in the hand of the public? In the summer of 2016, when I was a grad student at Harvard, we published a paper that made use of the UCMR data and connected it to a curated list of point sources, just like what you have seen in the film I showed before. We found that detection of PFAS in US drinking water is associated with more industrial sites, more military training areas, more airports, and more wastewater treatment plants in the same watershed. While this list is far from being complete, we shifted the discussion of PFAS contamination around single contamination site to a more systematic view. And by looking at contamination more systematically, important insights can be generated, such as the relative importance of different types of pollution sources. And putting the drinking water data on a map like this also highlights the data gap we have. The white space you see there on the map, those shows the areas that we don't have very good monitoring data for. And that accounts for about 1/3 of the US population. Now we know chemicals have made their ways from the point sources into our drinking water. So how does it impact health? It is not an easy task to connect environmental sources to health outcomes, and this conceptual framework shows why. Take PFAS as our example here. From various sources, PFAS can enter consumer products or environmental media, such as drinking water and diet. And humans get exposed through various pathways, and the aggregated signal can be reflected in the biomarker of exposure, such as blood. And from there, we need to conduct large-scale, long-term human epidemiological studies to understand the association between exposure and health outcomes. And traditionally, drinking water regulations have relied on animal toxicology experiments. But you probably already can tell the difference between animals and humans, as well as the difference in exposure levels, make it pretty hard to extrapolate from animal experiments. To better understand the impact of environmental sources, we need innovation on both the exposure assessment front and the epidemiological study front. For PFAS, we don't have a good understanding of what is the major exposure pathway for PFAS in non-occupational setting or outside contaminated sites. one way we can study this is to get matched tap water samples and blood samples through an individual level biomonitoring study. And a couple of years ago, we had a very exciting opportunity to work with an existing longitudinal cohort nurses health study to fill these important data gaps. And for those of you who are not familiar with the nurses health study, it started in 1976 when over 121,000 registered nurses were enrolled in the study, and they were followed up every other year to provide very detailed information on their diet, their lifestyle, and residential locations. In 1989-1990, matched serum and tap water samples were collected from a subset of the nurses. And even though our study was just a pilot study of 250 people, we already could discover some really exciting insights. Using both the toxicokinetic modeling approach and statistical regression approach, we found that the PFOA and PFNA levels in drinking water were statistically significant predictors for their levels in blood among people who drink more than 8 cups of tap water every day. We also quantified the relative source contribution, which means among the total PFAS exposure, how much of it comes from water. And we found that this proportion varies across different compounds and varies across different individuals. This has very important implications on how to craft drinking water standards that are health protective. The pressing question we face right now is that most monitoring studies are only generated quite recently, but people want answers about how did their past exposure to PFAS via drinking water affect their health now. We need the ability to reconstruct the entire exposure history. So in C8 Health Study, which is a pretty large epidemiological study in Mid-Ohio Valley, West Virginia, researchers have used environmental fate and transport modeling to reconstruct the exposure history. So this figure to your right shows the modeled concentration of PFOA for the past 60 years. Each line represents a private drinking water well. And as you can see to the right side of the graph, these dots are more recent empirical data from observations. So this model allowed epidemiologists to estimate PFOA level in study participants' blood given their residential history, which then allowed them to show how modeled PFOA exposure is associated with liver toxicity. So what is next in understanding the health impacts of drinking water quality? Over the past 30 years, the US has made impressive improvement on air quality. As shown on the graph to your right, as population and economy grew, air pollution levels continue to fall. And this is thanks to a good understanding of the health impacts of air pollution. And it was researchers like Joe Schwartz and Doug Dockery at Harvard who demonstrated that air pollution is linked to increased mortality. And these studies allowed organizations like the WHO, the Global Burden of Disease, to put out estimates like around 7 million people die every year as a result of air pollution exposure. It will help tremendously with more stringent drinking water rules if we have better understanding of the link between drinking water quality and health. So what is blocking the field of drinking water to make progress like air quality? So traditionally, drinking water quality data are generated through grab sampling. And what I mean by that is researchers have to go out, collect a drinking water sample, bring it back to the lab, run chemical analysis to quantify the level of chemicals in drinking water sample. And as you probably can already tell, this process has a couple of problems, such as low coverage, it is labor intensive and expensive, and the results are often delayed. some of my ongoing work at Mathematica is in collaboration with Professor Elsie Sunderland at Harvard and the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Protection involves using machine learning methods and data from diverse sources to predict the probability of having PFAS contamination in private wells. Some initial evaluation of the model suggests that our model can successfully reproduce the spatial distribution of detect versus non-detect in the state of New Hampshire. And I just want to show you that I'm not copy pasting the same map twice. I highlight a few regions where the model fit isn't so great yet. And you see the big cluster of red in the southern part of the state. And turns out that it is near a performance plastics manufacturer. So as our previous speaker, Randy, has pointed out, we are drinking plastics, literally. We feel this kind of work is important as more and more states are moving toward monitoring PFAS in drinking water, and resources can be allocated to high-risk areas of PFAS contamination if we have predictive models like this. So in summary, we learned that the majority of chemicals in drinking water are not regulated. PFAS exposure is ubiquitous in the US. Drinking water may be a significant source of exposure, and there is a diverse array of sources for PFAS in drinking water. We need better epidemiological studies and exposure assessments to link environmental source to health. And lastly, predictive models can help to fill the data gap left by lack of systematic monitoring data. I want to acknowledge my collaborators and funding sources, and thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cindy. That was incredibly informative and somewhat scary, but I guess such is the nature of this whole day. Although maybe the water on exoplanets will be less scary. But anyway, in all seriousness, it is amazing how all of this is so connected, because just like that graph that Randy showed, all of this water runs out into the oceans and also is involved in our drinking supply. And so a lot of people have asked the same question in the consolidated questions here. So I'll ask it for them, which is they're of course very worried about their own personal health, and they want to know whether any kind of commercial filtering systems actually get rid of the PFAS in the water that they drink, either bottled or drinking water from the tap.
Yeah, so there are a couple of filters available to remove PFAS from drinking water, and I encourage the participants to visit a nonprofit that is doing great work in this area called the Environmental Working Group. So they have put together a drinking water database that allows you to put in your zip code and look up the contamination found in your local drinking water supply. Also, EWG makes some recommendations on the kind of filters that could be used to remove chemicals from drinking water. However, when you use filters at your own home, cautions need to be taken that some filters need to be frequently changed. We already see recent studies showing the breakthrough of PFAS from filters. After using the same filter for some period of time, their filtering efficacy could decrease. So regular maintaining of the filter is important as well.
Thank you for that excellent public service announcement. But now I just have another question, kind of along the lines of what I asked Randy, where it's an unfair giant question that we'll try to cover in the discussion, but a preliminary answer might be nice. So you're at Mathematica, and clearly a lot of what you're doing would qualify as data science. And you mentioned that getting enough information about water quality and about pollutants in the water rather than in the air is hard compared to the air pollution data that you have. And so I'm curious, sort of what else needs to be connected if you wanted to make a proper model, kind of like those ones that you just showed, kind of the predictions of where to apply resources. What sort of general kinds of data do there need to be more of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm so glad to see Hillary showing a picture of using remote sensing data in her work, because I think that was a really powerful tool for air quality. Like, we're not relying on individual monitoring stations to get air quality data. We use remote sensing, and we use air fate and transport models to simulate those pollution levels and use that in subsequent research. And for water, I think a couple of progress needs to be made. Remote sensing on large scale water attributes like temperature or pH or chlorophyll concentrations could be useful in some ecosystems. Geology is important because we're talking about wells and groundwater, so soil properties needs to be well studied. And the map I showed for New Hampshire, that was actually a work in collaboration with scientists from USGS as well, where they have made available a lot of rich data sets on soil properties, geochemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So it's bringing together all those sources and to make existing observed data publicly available and interoperable, because a lot of the times the data were collected from individual studies and they can't be really easy to be combined and compared with each other.
Yeah.
Some investment on that infrastructure is important as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's great. Well, we'll try to consolidate all this at the end, but a lot of people were asking about that as well. So I'm going to take a tiny commercial break for a minute. And Chris, if you have one more question for Cindy, we can do that after I just make this just sort of thank you announcement. I've learned that members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and several annual donors to Radcliffe are joining us today for the Next in Water program. And I personally would like to really thank them for the support that they give to Radcliffe to make programs like this one possible. And I'm sure all of you on here, if you could all speak all at once, would thank them as well. So thank you very much to all of those supporters. And Chris, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, thanks, Elisa. Thanks, Cindy, for that very insightful talk. I just wonder if what you have shown us here is really the tip of the iceberg, and there are all kinds of molecules in our water that we're not monitoring. You know, thinking about petrochemically derived molecules. I'm sure there are all kinds of things being generated from the petrochemical industry that maybe the water monitoring agencies have been slow to pick up on, because I guess water monitoring is something that goes back, you know, many decades, and there must be many traditional approaches to assessing water quality. And I wonder how quickly the monitoring agencies are taking up the need to do a better job at monitoring chemicals in our water.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. With monitoring, we're actually making very exciting improvement on the analytical chemistry front. So as those technology become more and more advanced, we are able to see or like detect lower and lower concentration of substances in environmental samples, including water samples. Then the question is, what does the number mean? Like, what does 1 nanogram per liter of substance X in my drinking water mean? And I showed you the the numbers at two extremes: 80,000 chemicals in commerce and 96 chemicals regulated. There are a couple of numbers in between, such as we understand the toxicology effect of chemicals for around 300 or so of them. So we still have a pretty big gap from 300 to 80,000. And I know when I was a grad student at Harvard, I've heard of colleagues in the computational chemistry department making great progress on using computational models to predict the toxicity of chemicals given their chemical structure. And I think if manufacturers can take that information into the design, into the thinking, and screen the potential effects of chemicals before putting them into product, that could make the entire process a lot more streamlined and easy and efficient. But it calls for public-private partnership. It calls for a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration.
Thanks, Cindy. That was really great. And we will take up this discussion again later. And just so you know, the what'sinmywater.org link that Cindy mentioned during her talk is in the chat now. And we'll also use the chat after Laura's talk, which is coming up next, and possibly after the discussion or during the discussion, to tell you how to get to the breakout rooms that I keep mentioning. There'll just be another link that you have to open, but that's for later. But that's just suggesting that you look out for these messages that you'll see in the audience. So anyway, next we're going to have a talk from, is this working okay? Yeah, okay. From Laura Schaefer, who is going to talk about water on other planets. And when I was a kid, that was the stuff of science fiction. And I'll tell you that when I was a kid, junior assistant professor was the first time that there was real evidence for planets outside of our own solar system. And we now know about thousands of these. And Laura is probably going to explain that to you. But the concept of going in just sort of 25 years from we didn't even know that there were planets outside the solar system for sure, to we're studying the properties of water on planets like Earth, also known as rocky planets, is kind of mind-boggling. So I'll just leave it there and turn it over to Laura to hear what she has to say. Thanks, Laura Schaefer.
Thank you, Alyssa. Okay. Yes, it is my pleasure to be here to talk to you about water on exoplanets. So this is a completely different shift from what we had been talking about in the rest of the program. But in this talk, what I want to tell you about is my research is on this intersection between astronomy and geology. And I'm not going to focus on the actual role of water in biology. So I apologize if from my talk you were expecting a biology talk. This is not going to be one. What I'm going to talk about is the kinds of environments, the kinds of planets where we might actually find water to be stable on long time scales, suitable for complex life to develop on those planets. And so, as we know on Earth, water is a fundamental component of biological systems, and it forms an important environment and an ecology where biology exists and can thrive. But what I want to talk about today is just a few actually of water's many roles that it plays in overall planetary habitability on very long timescales. And what we've discovered in trying to find environments or planets where water is stable on long timescales is that water actually moderates the thermal evolution of a planet. The heat found within the interior of the planet is the driving energy that drives the geology at the surface of the planet. Heat causes the interior of the planet, the mantle, to convect. And on the Earth, that mantle convection is expressed at the surface as plate tectonics, which fundamentally alters and modifies the surface of our planet. And water actually plays a role in that thermal evolution process. And as a corollary, I'll tell you that water's presence on the surface, its continued presence over the history of the planet, actually depends on that plate tectonic process. And water on other planets can actually produce false biosignatures. In this case, these are planets that we might think would be habitable based on where we see them around a star, but in fact, they may actually have lost water, and the water may have produced a signature that we might interpret as signs of life if we're not careful in our interpretation. So here's an artist's imagining of what the night sky looks like if you could zoom in with your telescope eyes on a patch of stars. What we have discovered, as Alyssa mentioned, in the last 25 years is that most stars, in fact, have planets around them. Here, the sizes of the planets are a little exaggerated so that you can see them, of course, but almost all stars have at least one planet. In this figure, we're showing a population of planets that has been discovered over the last 20 years. And in fact, this figure, I'll admit, is a little bit out of date, but it still shows you sort of the different kinds of populations of planets that we have discovered around other stars, many of which we don't have examples of in our own solar system. Here, the planets are the little points on this figure, and they're shown as a function of their size and radius relative to the Earth. And their orbital period in days. So the Earth would be out here at about 365 days on this line of 1. And it's so it falls in this population, this very large population of planets that we have discovered that we believe are rocky, similar, potentially similar to the Earth and maybe Venus and Mars as well. Now, these planets have been discovered through two primary methods that gives us different information about the properties of those planets. The first is through transit observations. And in this method, what we're actually looking at is the planet's orbit is passing between us and the host star. And this is an image, an actual photograph of Venus passing in front of our sun that shows you exactly analogous what we're doing for exoplanets, is that we're looking for that shadow of that planet as it's passing in front of the star, and we're counting the light that we're getting from that star. And so the dip in light as the planet passes in front of it tells us about the size or the radius of that planet. The other method that we use to detect planets is called the radial velocity technique. And here we're measuring spectral lines from the star and looking at how those lines shift in wavelength due to the motion of the star about the common center of mass of the star and planet system. So here we're learning about the gravitational pull that the planet has on the star, and that tells us about the mass of the planet. And so these two methods combined tell us the mass and radius of the planet and tell us the density of that planet. And so when we have both measurements for a planet, we can confirm that it is in fact a planet and not some other astronomical event masquerading as a planet in our signals. And so since the first exoplanet was discovered something like 25 years ago, we have confirmed 4,500 planets around other stars. And there is another more than 5,000 candidates for which we have maybe only one of these detections. And so it's not necessarily a confirmed planet, but we have up to almost 10,000 potential planets that have been detected around other stars. And amongst these 10,000 planets, we have discovered that planets, small planets, are in fact really common. Planets down here in this yellow range where we might find habitable environments. Now, the planets that we want to talk about that have water on their surface that might be habitable, they exist in a region of space that we call the habitable zone. And the habitable zone is just an orbital range around a star at which on the surface of a rocky planet, water might actually be stable. And so this blue line, this blue curve that we're showing here is showing the position of the habitable zone for planets orbiting stars of different sizes. So the sun is up here at 1, but most stars, in fact, tend to be smaller than the sun. The most common kind of star is down here at lower mass ranges. And so we can see that the habitable zone depends on the mass of the star that the planet is orbiting. And it also changes with time as the star's luminosity evolves. Now, the boundaries of this habitable zone have been modeled based on predicted atmospheric properties for planets that would allow liquid water to be present on the surface of these planets. But something that's missing from this is actually the geology of the planet. So we know actually from looking at the Earth that water's presence on the surface over time, the abundance may change over time, and it depends on the operation of that plate tectonic cycle. So we know just by looking at the surface of our planet, we've heard a lot of great talks today about the effect that water has on our planet, the interaction that water has with our atmosphere, and the interaction that we have with it as human beings. But water also has a profound effect on the geology of our planet. So we can see this stunning image of this waterfall. The water is carving this rock and modifying the surface on very short timescales for a geologist of maybe 100 to 1,000 years. And we think often when we think about the way that water affects the surface of our planet, we think about this water cycle where we have evaporation from the oceans and precipitation onto the land and then erosion. But this is actually only a portion of what's going on our planet on the long time scale. And what we see at the surface is actually only part of the story. And the surface water cycle, it operates on these short timescales, but on long timescales, water is interacting with the entire interior of our planet as well. If you were here for Chris's opening remarks in the morning, he showed the size of the Earth's water relative to the size of the planet as a little blue droplet on the surface of the planet. And what he was showing there was the amount of water that we have at the surface. But in fact, we know that there is about as much water locked within the Earth's mantle as there is at the surface. So we in fact have two of those little bubbles, not just the one. And water is present in the Earth's mantle. It's locked inside of silicate minerals that we call nominally anhydrous minerals. So it's not a hydrated silicate, but it's present sort of dissolved in the sort of interstitial spaces of these minerals. And it exists in the upper mantle, and the way it gets into the Earth's interior is by reacting with oceanic crust. And during plate tectonics, what happens is oceanic crust actually sinks beneath continents, and it subducts into the mantle, and it transports water into the interior of the planet. And so this is how we might actually lose some of our surface water into the interior of the planet. Now, once it's in the interior, water actually has a really strong influence on the material properties of the silicates, and it can enhance melting and viscosity, as I'll discuss in a moment. But it will get transported from the interior of the planet back to the surface through melting and volcanism. And that happens at regions like arc volcanoes, like the Japan Islands, or it can happen at places like mid-ocean ridges that are producing ocean crust in the middle of our oceans. And so this exchange of water between the interior and the surface, it affects the long-term habitability of the surface of the planet, and it might impact how long biology can last on a planet and when it can actually start. So that water is affecting the properties of the interior of the planet, again, as I mentioned. So it changes the melting temperature of rocks to the point where it actually helps us get water back out of the interior of the planet. On this figure, I'm showing that a rock that doesn't contain any water at all has a melting curve as we go down into the interior of the planet, shown by this blue line. And if we add a lot of water into that rock and saturate it, the melting temperature at those high pressures actually drops by almost 800 degrees. So this is a substantial effect that water is having on the rheology of the planet. Water is also affecting the viscosity of the planet. This is the property that determines how quickly a material can flow, like water versus honey. Honey has a high viscosity, water has a very low viscosity. You might not think that rocks flow, but the mantle of the Earth does convect, and it has a viscosity. It's quite large compared to honey or water. But when you add water into it, it actually lowers the viscosity of the interior. And so it increases the rate of mantle convection. It increases the rate of plate tectonics and subduction. And so it modifies how water is being transported in and out of the interior of the planet. And so we can model how this happens. And in fact, what we know is that many of the planets that we have observed in the habitable zones of other stars that we think might be habitable are actually a lot larger than the Earth. They're what we call super Earth planets. And so this process, we can model it for the Earth, and we know how the history of water on the surface of the Earth might look, but we wanted to know, how does this operate on these larger planets? And so what happens is there's this temperature viscosity feedback, where as we add water into the mantle, through regassing or ingassing, it modifies the viscosity of the mantle, which causes the viscosity to drop, and that will allow the mantle convection rate to increase. That lets us put more heat out, and that causes the temperature of our interior to drop. And that then modifies the viscosity, which causes the viscosity to increase, slows convection, and allows water to build back up in the interior. So there's this feedback loop with water modifying the internal properties of the planet. And if we look at how this works for planets that are the size of the Earth or larger, we can look at the history, predict the history of water on the surface of these planets over the course of their lifetime. So here we're showing the history of water on the surface of a planet. This is just the mass of a planet relative to our surface water. So Earth has one ocean mass on the surface at the present day. And we're looking how water on the surface evolves over geologic time, starting from the time of that planet's formation. And we can see that we're showing this for different planet masses up to 5 times the Earth's mass. And we can see that it depends on the planet's size. And we just convert this here into a surface area fraction to look at how much of the surface of these planets should be covered by water. And we can see that for the larger planets, in fact, they have very little water on their surface right at the beginning of their lifetime. In fact, it takes almost 1 billion years, maybe 2 billion years, for oceans to start being released from the interior of the planet and forming a substantial reservoir on the surface. And so we have delayed ocean formation on some of these large rocky planets. And so that might impact both the origins of life and then the long-term stability of life. We can see that once water is established on the surface, it increases and becomes an increasing surface area coverage of that planet. With smaller planets, there might be some planets out there that Earth size are smaller. They in fact start gradually losing water to the interior of their planets. This is for a planet the size of Earth, but as we go to smaller planets, they may actually lose all of their water to the interior of their planet over the course of their habitable lifetime. And so this impacts the kinds of planets that we might want to look for when we're looking for life on exoplanets. Do we look for larger planets or older planets? If we're looking at a planet like the Earth, we might want to look at a younger planet. If we're looking at a planet larger than the Earth, we want to look for older planets to see established life. Now, going back to the habitable zone, and talking about how that habitable zone varies with time. We've talked about how the geology influences the habitability of the surface. But the evolution of the star's luminosity also influences not just the habitability, but whether a planet can in fact retain water on its surface and what happens to that water. So I'm going to draw your attention down to this planet down here, Proxima Centauri b. Proxima Centauri orbits a star about 1/10 of the size of our sun. And as you can see from this little movie, Proxima Centauri is actually interior to its habitable zone in its early history. That means that it is hotter, too hot, to have liquid water on its surface for that first period. And many planets that we see today in the habitable zones of stars, these very small stars, likely went through a period like this where they were too hot to have liquid water on their surface. And during this time, these planets may exist in what we call the runaway greenhouse state. And this can potentially cause these planets to lose a large fraction of their water. I just want to go over what the runaway greenhouse state is. So a planet in radiative equilibrium should be emitting as much radiation out into space as it is receiving from its host star in order to maintain a stable temperature. And when it's at equilibrium, those fluxes should be balanced. a planet with a lot of water on the surface, if it's receiving, will put out sort of a characteristic outgoing radiation, depending how much water is present in the atmosphere, because water is, in fact, a very large, very strong greenhouse gas. It has very strong absorption bands in the infrared where a planet's thermal energy would be emitted. And so it can trap heat at the surface of the planet. So as the amount of water vapor in a planet's atmosphere increases, its surface temperature increases. This figure over here on the right is showing us how much the surface temperature of the planet increases as we increase the water in the planet. So this is showing outgoing radiation. And so we can see what the surface temperature of a planet with a mostly water vapor atmosphere would look like for different absorbed shortwave radiations, assuming that they're in equilibrium. So if we are receiving less than the so-called runaway greenhouse threshold, the intersection of this line with this outgoing long wave radiation tells us the surface temperature, and this is a happy surface temperature where water is stable as a liquid at the surface, and our surface temperature is nice and habitable. Once we get above this boundary, though, this is what we call the runaway greenhouse threshold, and this is where water becomes optically thick in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere can't emit enough radiation to space to cool itself. And so what happens is if we're getting more radiation from our sun than this threshold, then our surface temperature starts to run away. So we have to look for the intersection if we're receiving 10 times the runaway greenhouse threshold with one of these lines out here. And we can see that if we have 10 times the runaway greenhouse flux and we have the equivalent of 100 bars of water, our surface temperature gets up to 2,500 Kelvin. That is hot enough to melt all the rocks at the surface of that planet. And so when a planet is in this runaway greenhouse threshold, depending on the amount of water it has on its surface, it might be in what we call a magma ocean phase. And so here we've just calculated for some of the small planet population how much water it would take to melt their surfaces. These planets are primarily all interior to their habitable zones, so these are not habitable planets, but we can see that it doesn't really take very much water at all to melt their surface. For reference, the amount of water that the Earth's surface has is shown by this dashed line up here, and we are plotting planets here based on how much radiation they're receiving from their stars. We have a couple of planets highlighted here that really only take up to 1 bar of water vapor in order to melt their surfaces. For reference, that's the total atmospheric pressure of the Earth. So very tiny fraction of the amount of water that Earth has on its surface. Now we can model how this will go for these small planets around these small stars and see how that impacts their total water abundance and their long-term habitability by modeling this magma ocean process. So we model the planet as a liquid ball of silicate rock. So this is a molten planet. And what happens here is that these small stars, because they're so bright, they're also putting out a lot of really damaging high energy radiation that heats the top of the planet's atmosphere. It photolyzes the water that's in that atmosphere into hydrogen and oxygen atoms and drives escape from the atmosphere, predominantly of the hydrogen, because it's a very light element. And some oxygen can remain on the planet, and it will interact with the surface of the planet. But in this process, we're losing our water abundance that we need for habitability, and we're also generating oxygen. So this is just a description of how that process works. So we have water is being photolyzed in the atmosphere and producing these hydrogen and oxygen atoms. And some of that hydrogen escapes and some of that oxygen remains on the planet and reacts actually with the interior of the planet. And so in order to understand how much oxygen builds up in the atmosphere, we have to take into account reaction with the surface. But the remaining oxygen, it builds up as a false biosignature. Now, oxygen on the Earth is produced almost entirely by photosynthesis, by life. And so for astronomers looking for signatures of life around other planets, they want to know what they can look for in the atmospheres of these planets that would be the signature of life. And oxygen has been a strong candidate because that's what we have in our own atmosphere. But here we're showing that oxygen actually is being produced just by water vapor. And so not only are these planets desiccated, they've lost their water, they've now built up this false biosignature as well. Here we're showing some of the calculations where we've taken a planet that has the same amount of water as the Earth and allowed it to evolve through this magma ocean phase, and we predict how much oxygen builds up in its atmosphere. So here yellow is essentially we have lost all of the water vapor, all of the hydrogen from our water vapor, and built up huge amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. So this yellow color represents to 200 to 300 times more oxygen in the atmospheres of these planets than exists in the Earth's atmosphere. And this is dependent on the chemistry of that mantle, because that oxygen can be taken out of the atmosphere and sequestered in the interior of the planet. But for a planet around a small star, we can see that if we have a wide range of initial water abundances, we can build up some of these massive oxygen atmospheres. Now we've looked through these models to see what these models are the most sensitive to, and we find less oxygen buildup in more massive planets. So super Earths will be less prone to this false biosignature. And it's also sensitive to some other planet parameters, but also sensitive to the stellar host star. So these are problems for planets around small stars like M dwarfs, but less of a problem for larger planets. And so this might guide where we try to look for signatures of life on other planets when we can probe the atmospheres of these small planets with future telescopes. So just to sum up, I've talked a little bit about some of the ways that water modifies the habitability of a planet on the long term, and how the actual geology of the planet also controls the water abundance on the surface. Oceans are forming later on larger planets and subducted away earlier on smaller planets. And so this will govern where life might be most stable and most happy on these planets that we're finding around other stars. And water can also produce this false biosignature that we have to be careful for when we go to try to find life on other planets. And so this should guide our observations in the future in trying to understand where we want to find life on other planets, but we have to be careful where we look. So I'll finish there, and thank you, and take your questions.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. That was a fantastic education for our audience. And our audience is not filled with biologists, but I'm pretty sure it's not filled with astronomers either. And so the biologists probably still have some questions for you. And I'll just, because we're going to go into the group discussion very soon, I'm just going to ask you kind of 1.5 questions. So my question is, if I wanted to try to sum up your talk, I would have to say that what you're doing is trying to make the best kind of estimates and calculations that you possibly can for not just where and what kind of planet might have water, but how long that water would last, right? And so, yeah.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
Because we want a planet that has water present when conditions are right for the origins of life, but we also want a planet that allows for long-term evolution of that life.
Right. And so it's sort of doubly complicated because, you know, we read all these super simplified articles in the popular media about habitable planets. And that assumes that, first of all, that water is key to life, which we don't even know if that's absolutely true on other planets. We can discuss that later. And then it also assumes that we want the conditions to be sort of like they are on Earth. And so that's what the sort of zone, the distance from the star means, right? And then nobody ever talks about what you were just talking about a lot, which is for what period of time. When we talk about the Drake equation, which some people may know is used to estimate the number of habitable planets, and usually the limiting factor is when a civilization destroys itself. That's the length of time that people are interested in. But there's a probably longer length of time where there's viable water on the surface of the planet, and that's a lot of what you were talking about. And so I know that you and I are both astrophysicists, so I understand what you're talking about. But I know even that the field that you work in is not that gigantically populated compared to all these other people working on exoplanets. So what is, I mean, like, do we know a lot about this? Is it is it you telling us? You know, how much do we really know about kind of how long water is likely to last on various planets?
That's a great question. There are a lot of people working on things like atmospheric escape, but understanding the connection between the atmospheres and the interiors over the long time period is not something that people have really gotten into very much for exoplanets yet, although people are getting there. But for the solar system planets, this is something that people have been working on for a long time. Earth is obviously our only actual example of a planet where water is currently present on the surface. But we definitely have evidence that water was present on the surface of Mars for much of its early history. And so understanding how Mars has lost water over its lifetime is important in constraining these kinds of habitable lifetimes for planets as well. And even Venus, although Venus we think of today as being much too hot to be habitable, there's arguments nowadays that, in fact, Venus could have been habitable for the first billion years of its lifetime. We think that Venus actually started off with water. The question is over what timescales Venus lost water. And some models, like mine, would predict it lost it on very short timescales and never had a habitable period. And other models suggest, in fact, that it could have been habitable for a much longer period. So we can try to test these kinds of models even within our own solar system.
That's perfect. You just anticipated my next half question. So I'm going to cede that to Chris and just say that there's a lot of questions here that people have asked that have to do with observing water on other planets. And so let's see if we can come back to that in the breakout rooms after or in the bigger discussion. But right now, I'll just cede the floor to Chris for a minute. And then after Chris's question, we'll start the group discussion with everybody. So hopefully everybody is ready for that. Go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that great talk. You know, I wanted to be Neil Armstrong when I was young. And I was looking out to the stars, and that's why I get on so well with Alyssa. Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. Let's not forget.
But yeah, I was very interested with what you were talking about with concerning subduction, and you know that you can lose water from the surface, either going into a planet or being lost. And so concerning the water that maybe gets subducted inside a planet, I guess there is a potential that will hold life, right? We will miss it because we can't see the water on the surface. We can't detect it spectrally, presumably. And I think more and more evidence is emerging that there is a lot of life inside our planet, right? And I wonder, yeah, how that may be another place where life could be harboring inside our universe.
Right, exactly. There is definitely life found within these subducting slabs as they're going into the interior of the planet. In fact, as these subducting slabs are going into the interior, because there is so much water there is actually, it reduces the melting temperature. And so we get a lot of actual melting right at the subduction zone. That's why we have this ring of fire around the Pacific. In fact, the arc volcanoes like the Japan Islands are produced by this voluminous melt that is produced by water going into the mantle there. And so that might not be the best conditions for life, but we know that there are many more habitable environments that probably exist on planets than we can observe remotely on exoplanets through biology. In fact, we think there's a huge diversity of water abundances that planets could have. They could have a tenth of the amount of water that the Earth has, or they could have 100 to 1,000 times the amount of water that the Earth has. If they have that large amount of water, we may actually have mantles of high pressure ice actually forming above our silicate mantles and an ocean above that ice. And so that would fundamentally change all of our ideas about habitable environments on that kind of planet as well.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. I have like 1,000 questions, but let's
me too.
Bring everybody together. Hopefully we can get that set up. And we have many questions from the audience, and Elliot's doing an excellent job of summarizing for us. So the speakers should know that they can actually peek at them if they want. And you in the audience can't, but you can keep asking questions. And so go right ahead. And Chris, would you like to start us off? Choose a question.
Yeah. Well, where to start?
I can ask my question while Chris is
Yeah,
deciding.
go ahead. Yes, yes.
I just wanted to have a short conversation, not take our whole 20 minutes or so, but a short conversation about where you think prediction is going in your various fields. We just heard Laura give essentially a whole talk about things that are almost unobservable. So, you know, those clearly are predictions. They have less impact on our life, although they might someday, you never know, than the rest of yours. But if you all just want to kind of just jump right in, go ahead and see. It's hard on Zoom to all talk at the same time, so just go ahead and try. Or I can single you out. I can say, Randy, what do you think?
Oof, don't start with me. You're thinking about predictions?
About if you were going to say, in other words, when we were talking, for example, during your talk about the coral reefs and that the coral reefs managed to come back. If you were to take what you know, either empirically or theoretically in some way about the biology and ecology of coral reefs, could you tell me, if I found you a ruined reef and I said, okay, I'll leave it alone under such and such conditions for 20 years, could you tell me what it's going to look like? Do we know that? Or is it all just we need examples of everything?
This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. There's something in sort of an ecological sort of concept of succession, right? So thinking about the transition of ecosystems and how they start in the beginning or after a major disturbance and move through until they reach what's called a climax ecosystem, until they reach a stable place where they'll stay for a while. And we haven't really watched coral reefs do that from beginning to end enough to know what the indicators are, to sit there and say, okay, coral reef ecosystem in place X, Y, or Z, you're this far along on this pathway or trajectory, and we know exactly how long it's going to take you to get to the end. And I think there's a couple reasons we don't know that. One is that there are very few opportunities to sort of witness a completely denuded coral reef, or previously, right, under a natural situation and watch it regrow all the way through. So there are some places where actually there's been some lava flow and you can get a reef starting from scratch. But oftentimes if there's disturbance, it's, especially these days, right, there's multiple disturbances happening again and again and again and again and again. So those successional trajectories keep getting interrupted. So I think it's really hard to say at any given reef at any given time, how long is it going to take and to end? Will it ever reach its former glory or what it used to look like before? The other thing that I think I'll say about that is that there's no guarantee at any point in any disruption, right, that an ecosystem will return to exactly what it looked like previously. And so a lot of these changes or disruptions that we see are, there's an element of stochasticity to them. And I think that is augmented and amplified under the conditions of global change. So what I can tell you is that in a place like the Phoenix Islands, where we have no people, really, there's 25 people roughly on one island out of 8. And so imagine 25 people in a place the size of California, really far away, where the closest people to you, Laura, this is for you, are on the International Space Station, times a couple of factors depending on where it is in its orbit. We have the best chance of being able to answer that. And what I can tell you is that we do see recovery and in a relatively quick time frame. So in the order of a decade up to 2, you can see recovery happen fairly quickly. But does it look the same as it did before? And at any given point, if I could look at it, could I tell you that it would be the same again? No. And I think it's that element of stochasticity, and in our time of modern global change, that really complicates that question.
Right. And so you just certainly don't have enough examples to sample those statistics, especially if they're so unpredictable like that. Yeah.
I think it's
that's
also
interesting.
That the world is changing too fast for us to be able to see how these corals are going to respond in real time. And I also think this is a little maybe funny to say, but I think there's a real place-based contextualization to this, where not every reef in every place is going to respond the same way. There's a lot of local factors that are going to contribute. So even if we had a couple of examples from a couple of places, I'm not sure that they would port the world over. I think that there's a really important localization factor.
I'll just put in a plug. Later, well, actually next year, we're having a big science symposium called The Future of the Future, because yours truly is obsessed with prediction, and it talks about how we'll make predictions in the future. And so I'm gonna not monopolize this conversation talking only about prediction unless somebody else wants to jump in. I'm instead just gonna say one thing and then turn it over to Chris, which is that in my own work on prediction, I have found now many times, if you look at the difference between Laura and not Laura, but physics, okay, where we've had kind of predictive theories for a very long time, she's making predictions of things that, like I said, not insultingly, kind of amazed, you can't see, okay, but she's quite seriously using physics to make those calculations. And then if you look at what Cindy was talking about, she's talking about at some level biology, but at some level chemistry. And I'm guessing that's a little bit more predictable. And then the closer you get to biology and, God forbid, human behavior, it's like completely unpredictable, right, Hillary? And so, that's something that if you stick around for the breakout rooms, I think it might be interesting to talk about that some more. So if anybody has a very quick question or comment about that, go ahead. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it right over to Chris. But does anybody want to say anything about that quickly?
Well, I'll just echo what you just said, Alyssa, about this difference in our ability to predict physics versus chemistry versus biology, which I think about a lot in using the kind of global Earth system models that we use to make projections about climate change. And so these are giant models run on supercomputers where we have to write an equation for every teeny tiny grid cell on the entire Earth and the ocean, land, atmosphere. And so we have to write equations for all of the physics, chemistry, biology, and ecosystem processes. And we know those equations for the physics of how the climate works way better than for the ecosystems. They're missing so many of the components that, say, Randy brought up in her talk to be able to think about how ecosystems are going to respond to these changes. And I'll say that we're missing both having the observations like Randy was describing to be able to write those equations. And we're actually at this point still also missing the computational power. Even if we were to try to parameterize everything we knew about biology, we actually don't have the supercomputing power to even be able to run those models with all of that.
Thank you. You just summarized my whole prediction class. So thank you very much. And I'm glad to hear a real expert on climate say what I have sort of indirectly gleaned to be true over the last 5 or so years. So Chris, what was the question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I think I've got a question that manages to pull together a whole bunch of questions from the audience and should interest several of you. So, and leading off from predictions, and of course, we learn a lot about predictions by learning from the past. So I wonder about the history of water on Earth. What do we know about that? Has the amount of water on Earth always been the same on the surface of the Earth, or has it changed? Do we know if it's changed? And what do we know about how temperature and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which affect the acidification of the ocean, how have they changed over the 3 billion years, at least, when we have had life on the planet? I'm just wondering how much we know about the history of water and the ocean on Earth. I'm sure Hillary, Randy, Laura for sure have things to say on that.
Well, I can definitely speak to sort of history of water on the surface of the Earth. And in fact, we don't know its history as well as we would like to, because the Earth is a geologically active planet. And so unfortunately, it tends to erase all the evidence that we want to look at. But we do have good evidence from the last about 500 to 700 million years that the sea level relative to the continents has been relatively constant. We can also measure present day rates of volcanism and calculate ingassing rates and look at how much subduction is going on and compare that to, so ingassing rates and outgassing rates, we compare that and see that they're close to a steady state at the present day, although there does seem to be a little bit more flux of water going into the mantle right now than there is coming out of the mantle. And so that would support some of these models that suggest slowly as the planet ages, what happens is that the rate of plate tectonics tends to slow down as the mantle cools off and convection slows. And so you get transport of water into the mantle and there isn't sufficient heat to melt as much of it. And so less of it comes back out. And so that's what we predict to happen, is that as the planet ages, there should be less water present on the surface. Now, the other complicating factor in trying to understand the history of water on the surface is we don't know how the size or the mass of continents on the surface has changed. On the Earth, we have continents and we have oceans, and it's because the ocean floor is much lower than the continents that we have these big ocean basins. But continents are produced by sort of a secondary process after the formation of oceanic crust. And so we think that continents were not necessarily present in the same abundance over the course of the Earth's history as they are today. And so that complicates our interpretation of the geologic record and understanding the history of water on the Earth.
So Hilary, how about pH and temperature changes in the ocean over deep time?
Yeah, so I was actually going to bring up here the idea that we can think about these questions on a really wide range of timescales, right? Laura, you're thinking about over the entire history of the Earth and how these things have changed over time. And this is something I like to bring up in teaching my intro oceanography class, that when we're talking about like, where did the ocean come from, plate tectonics, why do we have ocean basins? We're thinking about very different timescales than what I think about in my research trying to understand recent climate evolution and how climate will change in the future. So for instance, thinking about the total amount of water in the oceans today, if I'm thinking about, say, paleoclimate records, I'm often thinking about what's happened over, say, the past 800,000 years, very short timescales on what Laura was talking about, and thinking about how much of that water is in the ocean versus is locked in ice on land. And so we can make calculations of how relative sea level is changing over time as we move our water between being stored in ice on land and our large ice sheets today in Antarctica and Greenland versus having that water in the ocean. And Chris, you were also asking about the question of ocean acidification and how the pH of the ocean has changed over time. And I would say that our paleo proxies for ocean acidification are much newer and still more under development than our proxies for understanding sea level and how the total amount of water in the oceans has changed over time. So I'll say that's an area where we're still calibrating those proxies to try to figure out what they can tell us about really long time scales and how that might inform how we think about ocean acidification will change going forward.
I'm so glad you brought up timescales, Hilary, because there's a related question here for Cindy. And the way I can relate it to timescales, the way it's related to timescales in my head is that ocean acidification and changes in the composition of the ocean. I'll tell you later how I spent time at Goddard with all those ice cores once upon a time. But yeah, people have these drillings, you know, beneath the surface of the ocean that have these unbelievable fossil records of the chemistry of the ocean. But Cindy, we don't have any fossil records of, you know, weird chemical pollutants or plastic that we were hearing about from Randy, you know, in the fossil record, right? So we have even less data. And so you were talking mostly about the effect of the PFAS on humans, the potential effect on humans. But one of the audience members wants to know more about if anybody is studying their effect more broadly on marine ecosystems. And I just say that this is on short timescales because first of all, it's only been a problem for a very short time. And secondly, to go back to what everybody else is saying, there's almost no data because this is unprecedented. And so what is the story with kind of wider studies of the dispersion of these things over time?
Yeah, speaking of timescale here, for PFAS, we're only going to look at the past several decades because that's when the chemicals start to be manufactured in the 1950s. But from that point onward, I've read research doing studies in ice cores, actually, Alyssa, to your point, near the polar regions, because PFAS is extremely persistent. It has this potential to go on long-range transport. And one of the ways to study how PFAS generated in like where humans tend to live, mid and low latitude, get all the way up to the polar region is by looking at atmospheric deposition. And researchers have used ice cores to study that. So I just want to quickly respond to your comment there and then answer your question on the impact of PFAS on marine life. And I think Hillary mentioned this in her talk, like ocean is the ultimate sink for a lot of things, and PFAS is one of them. So with PFAS, it's got emitted into the air, and the biological pump that was also brought up by previous speakers that is responsible for pumping carbon dioxide from surface atmosphere into the ocean is also responsible for transporting some of the PFAS and PFAS precursors in the air into the surface ocean. And then from there, we're actually able to measure PFAS in phytoplanktons, and from phytoplanktons, they enter the food web or the food chain with biomagnification all the way, depending on how high you want to count up to the food chain. And then one of my previous collaborators is studying whales in Faroe Island, and they're pretty high up in the food chain through biomagnification. A lot of very high concentrations of PFAS could end up in the whale's body, and they are important for indigenous people living in those regions because whale meat is their cultural food, and a lot of people do rely on whales as their nutritional resource, and that has led to another whole suite of public health problems. It's also pretty challenging to do intervention because on one hand, we don't want populations living there get exposed to environmental chemicals. On the other hand, it is part of their culture and their traditional diet.
Yeah,
it's pretty complicated.
Very complicated. I think Chris has a question.
Yeah, just leading on from that, you're saying that these organics like PFAS are very persistent. Presumably they hang around for hundreds or thousands of years potentially. So are we do we run the risk of contaminating our water supply, irreversibly? And do you think there's a risk that we're going to run out of drinking water in the future? And if so, do you have any solutions to that? Through groundwater or desalination of ocean water or what?
Yeah, those are a lot of big questions, and I'm sure my fellow panelists can speak more adequately to the quantity of water. On the persistence side, I'll just quickly mention that PFAS, if you look at the chemical structure of PFAS, it's characterized by this carbon-fluorine chain, and carbon-fluorine chain is the strongest bond we know in organic chemistry because the two atoms are so small and the bond between them are so strong. That is why PFAS are persistent and they almost never break down. If you are really trying to look at their lifetime in the environment, it's probably on the scale of millennials. And due to the persistence, once they get into the water supply, it is really hard to remove them unless you use other ways like filter them out. But even though we use filters, then the question comes, what do you do with the filters that contain all these chemicals? So if you want to 100% like absolutely eliminate PFAS from the filters, then probably you have to go up to very high temperature that breaks down the carbon-fluorine bond, but that is very extreme condition. And I'll probably just stop here and let other fellow panelists address the water availability and quantity question.
Thanks. Who wants to take that question? Chris, did you have someone in mind you wanted to pick on?
I was wondering if Hillary maybe has some perspectives on this in terms of, the energy required for desalinating salt water to convert it into drinking water, and the need for, again, petrochemicals to provide the energy to desalinate the water. If we're always within this cycle of this dependency on petrochemicals, sometimes it just seems so difficult to wean ourselves off of it. We're going to have to find alternatives. And you clearly think about these things very often as well. And what do you see in terms of alternative energy sources that will avoid us contaminating our oceans, our water supply with organic pollutants, with microplastics and so on? Brandy, maybe you have some things to say too.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really big questions, and I'll certainly say that drinking water supply and the availability of groundwater are outside, I think, any of our areas of the folks who are here today. But certainly this question you raised of if we were to reach a point that we didn't have adequate freshwater supply and needed to desalinate ocean water, clearly one problem in that is the incredible amount of energy that is required to do that kind of desalination. And then also making sure to be careful about the quality of that water, which is definitely also outside my expertise. But right, as we think about like the microplastics that Randy has been talking about, if you go to the store and you buy sea salt that they've evaporated, there are microplastics in that sea salt because there's microplastics in the water. And so thinking carefully about the kinds of questions that Cindy raised for the quality of the water would also be relevant for thinking about desalination processes. And then of course, these questions you raised, Chris, of trying to switch the energy that we use from being petrochemicals to thinking about sustainable energy sources like solar and wind. I'm not sure there's a particular difference in the way we would do that for thinking about desalination versus other things that we need to use energy for. We need to make those choices even independent of needing extra energy to supply our drinking water. But I think it does raise this larger question that as we think about changing the energy we use, we're also going to need to think about adaptation to ongoing climate and environmental changes. People often talk about that with things like air conditioning and making sure that we have the energy to do all the things we need to do, not only to mitigate climate change, but also adapt to it at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. I'm going to ask the last question to two people in kind of two parts. And so we have a big question here that was asked by the audience that says, what is so special about water that allows it to enable life? So that is a huge question, but I'll turn it into sort of just two pieces. And so I'll ask Laura about studies of other planets. We'll put that second, where people are doing these observational studies, which people also asked you a lot about, Laura, even though I know that's not really exactly your area, but people want to know, how do we look for water as evidence of life? So we can talk about that on exoplanets. But then the other one is Randy. We've heard from Cindy and Hillary. We know from personal experience why humans need water. We're pretty sure about human biology and what happens to if you don't have enough water. But coral is like underwater, and I'm pretty sure that if you take it out of the water, all that pretty white coral we see is dead. And so could you just tell us like a teeny little, freshman biology explanation of why coral needs water? And then we'll end with Laura telling us about people looking or not looking for evidence of life by only using water or something else. So go ahead, Randy. Do you have a quick answer for the stupid physicist who doesn't know enough biology to even understand why corals need water?
Love conversations like this. It's so
okay.
fun. I have to tell you, I have never once sat there and questioned or even thought about why corals need water, because they do, right? They're but I guess, it's the medium that they live in, right? And so their entire biology is adapted to this medium, right? Their food is, being filtered from water. They have structures. I don't even want to really call. They're not nearly as complex as humans, or a larger or more derived animal that has a whole lot of sort of different compartments and organs and complex tissue structure. But for what they have, right, they are depending on the physical properties of water to maintain, for example, the fluid pressure in their gastrovascular cavity, right, or in their
Right.
polyp extension, right? And so they have these fluid-filled tissues that are constantly in contact with water. And
so they basically have evolved perfectly to live in water, and if we mess that up, we mess that up.
Life came from water, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like
perfect transition. Okay, Laura, we have
water.
like
We
1 minute
started in water.
We're going to go to the breakout rooms very soon. So Laura, in 1 minute or less, tell us why people are constantly looking for water as evidence for life on other planets.
Right. So NASA, because it is in the business of trying to find life both in the solar system and exoplanets, has come up with a definition of life. And it's sort of, it's an interesting definition. It is that life is a self-perpetuating chemical system that can undergo Darwinian evolution. And you notice there's no mention of water anywhere in that. But fundamentally, we're looking for water because the only example of life that we know of requires water. The origins of life scenarios that have been developed for the Earth all require chemical reactions that are happening in a medium that allows easy transport of anions and electrons. And the fundamental solvent on the Earth is water. And water is so ubiquitous in the universe. It is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and oxygen is, 5 or 6. So it's very abundant. It forms everywhere. It is, ubiquitous to many planetary systems. And so we're looking for what we know, because until we find a second example, we don't have any other clues for which to direct our searches.
Got it. I'm just going to quote my friend and colleague Bob Kirshner, who used to be, who's emeritus now in the Harvard Astronomy Department. He was interviewed that year, I think it was 1995 or 96, when the first planets outside the solar system were found. And at that point, the same way that we're looking only for water now as a way to think about life, he said, we were only looking for solar systems that look exactly like our solar system. And if you don't know, the first solar, Laura knows, but the rest of you, if you don't know, the first solar systems that were found were nothing like our solar system. They had these giant Jupiter-like planets next to the star that was being observed. And it was kind of like, who ordered that? And so I don't know if someday we're going to find a planet or life that doesn't involve water. But thank you for that answer, Laura. And thank you all so much. And I just have to publicly thank the events staff at Radcliffe and the people in Academic Ventures who made this program so incredibly seamless. And thanks to the speakers for doing such a great job. And I'm not actually saying goodbye. I'm saying hello to the reception we will have in the Zoom rooms. And before I do that, I'm just going to tell you about a couple of events that are coming up at Radcliffe. And there will be some future science programs. And in particular, there's a lecture by Anne Wojcicki, and she's going to be interviewed by Jonathan Zittrain. She's the one who started 23andMe. So that's going to be a very interesting discussion of genetics and the future of knowing about genetics and your own in society. And then there'll be a panel discussion about, COVID seems kind of topical, in December with some local experts, including Mark Lipsitch and Carolyn Buckey, and an expert from St. Andrews, whose name I believe is Mugia Cevic, who's going to talk about the epidemiological studies of COVID as well. And then, of course, there's that plug I put in already for the Future of the Future, the Science Symposium, which is coming up in late April and still has a tiny chance of being in person, but might be online. And now that I see how well this worked, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. But what we're going to do now is the speakers, you'll notice, are dropping off, and I'm still here. to tell you to please go to tinyurl.com/nextinwater. And I believe that that is in the chat that you can see. And I'll just say it again in case you can't see it. It's tinyurl.com/nextinwater, like all one word, the name of this event. And if you go there, you'll be put into a kind of waiting area, and some of us will join you again shortly. Actually, all of us on the speakers list and some additional guest hosts. And we'll break you up into small groups and we'll pretend to be drinking coffee and eating pastries. So I'll see you there in just a couple of minutes. Thanks again to everyone.